Well, hello and welcome to each of you. So glad to be here with you this evening. And we're really looking forward to the topic that we're going to be covering this evening on EMPs. You know, this has to be one of the most often asked topics or questions that we get. And so it seemed like it was high time to do a class on this topic. So we're so glad to have you here. I'm glad to see lots and lots of folks here. Thanks for letting me know that you can see and hear and all that sort of thing. Very helpful. So why don't we go ahead and get started? I've got just a couple of preliminaries, but they're just going to be real short, and then I want to jump right into the class because I've got a lot to cover, and I want to make this as brief as possible and really get to the point and get you some simple but solutions that you can implement to help your solar system to be operational even after a EMP. And if you don't know what an EMP is, no worries, we're going to cover the basics to begin with of what an EMP is, how it can affect things, and all of this sort of thing. And then we'll be getting into how to deal with a solar system in the event of a EMP. So without further ado, let me go ahead and put my slide up here. And okay, there we go. So glad to have you here with us. I'm Nick Meisner, and I'll be your presenter for the class this evening. And if my wife Lisa is able to, she'll be manning the chat box a little bit. We have two little ones, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. And so they kind of keep us on our toes. And so she may have to step out every now and then, but she's going to try and do what she can to man the chat box. And then I'm going to be hopefully getting to all the questions that I can at the end of the class. And so we'll get into that in just a minute here. And so one thing I wanted to say is before we get too far, it sounds like we've got a really good connection, but if you could just type yes in the box if you can see me and hear me. It helps me to know. If you have any problems along the way, there should be a reconnect button on the top of your page. Just click that and it will reload the page, and that should fix probably 90% of the issues that you're likely to experience. And if that doesn't work, you might try a different internet browser. You know, sometimes these things can be a little finicky. It could depend on your internet connection too. So if you've got someone else on your internet connection and they're watching videos and stuff like that, you might ask them if they could hold off while you're watching the webinar if you have any trouble. So I see lots of yeses coming in. That's good. Sounds good. So we're ready to roll here. One thing that I wanted to mention is if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. Feel free to use the chat box and, you know, whatever you need to do there. But if you need to ask me something, if there's a particular question that comes up during the presentation and you need to ask me about that, make sure that when you're typing in your question, there's a little button next to where you type in, and you can toggle that to make it be a question. It can either be a comment, like a chat comment, or you can click on it and toggle it and turn it, change it to where it says, mark this as a question. Those are the things that I'm going to see. I'll be trying to pause every now and then to take a question or two, and at the end I'll be diving into questions also. But that's what I'm going to be looking at, are the ones that are marked questions. So just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. And if you're on a smartphone, you don't see the chat box, just swipe up. Probably the chat box is down below your slide. And so if you swipe up, you should be able to see the chat box and things that I'm referring to, and then you can swipe back down and get back to the slides, hopefully, if all goes well. So question for you. There will be a little poll that appears on your screen. If it hasn't already, then it should momentarily. And I've just got a question for you. would you be seriously interested in going off the grid with a solar system if the cost was workable, if you could live a normal lifestyle, and if it was reasonably prepared for EMPs? So yes or no, just do your answer on the little poll. And while you're doing that, I'm going to run through real quick what we're going to be covering in this class, what you're going to learn in this class. We are going to look first at what an EMP is, and then we're going to look at how an EMP would affect life today. Then we're going to take a look at how an EMP would affect your solar power system. And then finally, we're going to take a look at my strategies for keeping a solar power system operational after an EMP. And if you want to get the most out of this class, then I have one important suggestion for you. Please remove any distractions that you can. You'll get the most out of this class if you put into it your full attention. And so if you're serious and you're here to get some great tips, please take just a moment to remove any distractions that you possibly can. And with that said, let's jump into our first section. What is an EMP, or an electromagnetic pulse? Now, a number of years ago, we had the privilege of interviewing a United States congressman who was intimately involved with the Congressional EMP Commission and the congressional hearings on the EMP threat. I'd say that he was the expert in Congress on electromagnetic pulse during his 20 years of service as a representative. And this congressman relentlessly fought to bring the EMP issue to prominence and to stimulate our nation to action. He was trying to get the government and the private sector to start making serious preparation for a threat that he felt had been grossly underestimated, or really even forgotten about. His name is Roscoe Bartlett from the state of Maryland. And I thought it would be most appropriate to let him introduce this topic of what is an EMP, because it's a topic that has been so heavy on his heart for so many years. So I'm going to play a little video clip here. Give me just a second to load the video for you. And I think you'll find this very interesting. It's just a short clip, but this is Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, former Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, on what is a EMP.
There is a phenomenon very well known to people who plan wars and build weapons that the average citizen may not know about, and that is called EMP. And this is electromagnetic pulse. It's produced various ways, but the most widespread pulse would be produced by a nuclear weapon detonated above the atmosphere. Our country has only one experience with that. This was in 1962, I believe it was, over Johnston Island, and we had an extra atmospheric burst. The weapon was detonated above the atmosphere, and this produced a surprising consequence. There was a huge flow of what today are called Compton electrons, and it was like a huge solar flare, orders of magnitude stronger than a solar flare, like really strong static electricity everywhere all at once. Another way of thinking about it is like a lightning strike everywhere. The Russian generals tell us that the Soviets, and I can quote this because this is in the public domain, it's not classified, tell us that the Soviets had developed an EMP weapon that produced 200 kilovolts per meter at the center. A weapon detonated 300 miles high above the United States would reach a line of sight the margins of our country, Florida and northwest Washington. And this would produce at the margins about 100 kilovolts per meter. If that's true, that is considerably more, I think, than anything that we designed and tested to during the Cold War when everybody was concerned about EMP. By the way, almost any country that has nuclear weapons in any war game, an EMP laydown is an early occurrence in that war game. And when the referee is there monitoring the war game, they just take their hand and wipe most of the assets off the table. Because what the EMP does is to, if it's strong enough, and 100 kilovolts per meter would be strong enough, it fries all microelectronics. That means there will be no more computers. Your car is full of them. There will be no more electricity. The only person you can talk to is the person next to you, unless you happen to be a ham operator with a vacuum tube set, which is 1,000,000 times less susceptible. The only way you can go anywhere is to walk, unless you happen to have a car that has a coil and condenser. And then you, of course, need to get some gasoline for your car. This would be a horrendous kind of an experience. I sponsored legislation about 6 years ago that set up an EMP commission. I'm sure if you do a Google search, you can find this. This EMP commission, unlike most commissions that work for a year or two and are then retired, the EMP commission is still working because this is very serious. Our Pentagon is looking at all of their weapons systems. By the way, our military is very concerned about the power grid. And they are looking at what's called islanding, because they get much of their power from the private sector. Now, they, like a hospital, they have some generators and some diesel, but that's only going to run for a little while. Then what do you do when that runs out? Because the grid could go down and stay down for a very long time. It is kind of on the edge, on the margin. And you may have noticed that when there is a tiny problem in one place, that can really cascade and bring the power down, as it did in Florida not very long ago, over a very wide area when several million people are out of electricity for a number of hours. So there are a number of events that could create a situation in the cities where civil unrest would be a very high probability. And I think that those who can and those who understand need to take advantage of the opportunity when these winds of strife are not blowing to move their families out. I'll tell you something else about this. It's just plain fun. When you're looking at the challenge of what do I have to do so that I'm independent of the system.
Wow, pretty interesting, huh? So let me get this back up here. So there we go. That was quite something, wasn't it? That was quite an awakening to me when Congressman Bartlett laid that out. That was a number of years ago, and I was not very familiar with EMP. And so I just want to recap a little bit of what Congressman Bartlett said and elaborate just a bit more on what an EMP is. It's a short burst of electromagnetic energy. Don't worry, we're not going to get super technical here. This is only for a quick minute or two of foundational info to work with. But a EMP may be from a solar geomagnetic storm, or it could be from man-made weapons like nuclear blast, or perhaps even other weapons that can produce EMPs. And a nuclear EMP consists of 3 separate types of pulses, or whatever you want to call it. There's E1, E2, and E3. And we'll talk about each of these just for a brief minute. But just so you're aware, a solar storm or a geomagnetic storm generally only contains one type of these, and that's E3. It's the nuclear EMP that has all 3 of these, and that's part of what makes it so nasty. So anyhow, a nuclear EMP, the E1 is the quick high voltage burst, and it peaks in as little as 5 nanoseconds. Now, 5 nanoseconds, as you're probably well aware, is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a second. This E1 lasts a short duration, just a fraction of a second as long as it lasts, and it's very high energy. And E1 is probably the most likely to damage your electronics or solar components. It happens so fast that even lightning arresters are typically not able to clamp down fast enough. For instance, one of my favorite lightning arresters, the Midnight Solar SPD, it's rated to clamp down in as little as 15 nanoseconds, which is great for lightning, but it's just not fast enough for E1. Now, E2 is similar to a nearby lightning strike. It's of moderate duration, and when I say moderate, that's relatively moderate, because we're still talking less than a second, maximum of a second. And it's a moderate amount of energy. And this is probably the easiest of the 3 to protect against, since most systems already have lightning protection of some form built in, and the E2 is similar to a lightning strike nearby. However, the main difficulty with E2 could be the fact that the E1 pulse has just gone before it, just a fraction of an inch before it, and it may have damaged or temporarily disabled the equipment that would normally protect against lightning, or E2. And so even this is not a sure shot, because you've got multiple things going on here in just a fraction of a second. And so we don't really know how well equipment like this would hold up under a barrage like that of not just the E1, but then in a fraction of a second, the E2 also. So it's not a sure shot. And then E3 is similar to a solar or geomagnetic storm. It's lower energy, but it's much longer duration, up to hundreds of seconds. And E3 is most likely to affect the power grid and anything with long lengths of wire that acts as an antenna. And because of the effects of E3, it can last for a couple of minutes. And my understanding is that the bulk of the expected damage from E3 would be from overheating and damaging transformers and similar equipment on the power grid, because they've got long, many, many, many miles of wire in their system. And some of these extremely large transformers can take months to replace. Unlike a nuclear EMP, an EMP that's caused by a solar or geomagnetic storm only consists of the E3 component, like we mentioned earlier. But a nuclear EMP has all three of these, E1, E2, and E3, and that's why it's really destructive. Now, I want to take just a minute. I mentioned about transformers, that the E3 goes after the transformers in the power grid. I want to play you a clip that's just about 1 minute long from Congressman Bartlett again about the transformers, and let him explain about that for just a minute. So hang on here and let me load the video for you. Like I said, it's about a minute, roughly a minute long. So here we go, Congressman Bartlett again.
I think that one just needs to extrapolate from what has happened when the power has gone off for several hours or a couple of days. And then everybody knows it's coming back on. We could have events in the future where the power grid will go down and it's not in any reasonable time coming back on. For instance, if when the power grid went down, some of our large transformers were destroyed, damaged beyond use. We don't make any of those in this country. They're made overseas, and you order one, and 18 months to 2 years later, they will deliver it. Our power grid is very vulnerable. It is very much on the edge. Our military knows that. And as I mentioned previously, they're looking at what they call islanding. How can they separate themselves so that they can be a functional entity when the grid goes down? Because much of their power now comes from the grid itself. They're very much dependent on the civil infrastructure. By the way, the EMP Commission ended up spending most of their time looking at the civil infrastructure. They were to focus originally on what it would mean to our military, the EMP laydown, but they were just so stricken with the potential vulnerability of our grid. They likened it to a big house of cards that would just come tumbling down.
That's something. Okay, so I want to talk to you for a minute about how large of an area that an EMP could potentially affect. So first of all, it depends on a number of factors. There's the source of the EMP, whether it's a solar solar storm or geomagnetic storm, whether it's a nuclear detonation, and things like this depends on the source of it. It depends on the amount of power that the EMP is conveying. Typically, this is kilovolts per meter when you're referring to a nuclear EMP. So the more powerful it is, most likely the further reach and the more damage it's going to be able to do. But especially the big factor is the height at which the EMP occurs. And this is once again referring particularly to a nuclear blast. With the curvature of the Earth, the higher that the blast occurs, the higher the altitude, the more area that the EMP is able to reach, because it's pretty much a line of sight thing. So you kind of have to be line of sight to the EMP. So the higher it is, the larger the footprint. And then there's other factors like the current condition of the Earth's magnetic field and almost an infinite number of other variables, but those would be the main ones. Now, as far as the size of the EMP effect, this kind of gives you an idea of what I was referring to earlier. It's pretty much line of sight. So, typically you hear of EMPs being extra atmospheric or detonated above the atmosphere, but it is possible for an EMP to be detonated at lower altitudes. While this would likely affect a smaller area, being at a lower altitude could make it significantly worse for that area by adding other components like damage from the blast itself and radiation and things like that. But as you can see, burst altitude of 30 miles gives it roughly a radius of 480 miles. Burst altitude of 120 miles, and you get an affected radius of 1,000 miles roughly. That's radius, once again, not diameter. And it would take a blast at about 300 miles to cover the footprint of the continental United States, roughly. Now, bear in mind that the area of coverage is only one factor. It has to also be strong enough to do a lot of damage. And bear in mind that since an EMP is line of sight, if you have a mountain in the way, that could be a huge help for you locally. There would still be the overall effect on the nation and your general area, but it's possible that your specific location could be spared to a certain extent by geography. So I want to move on to how would an EMP affect life in our modern society, just briefly. So what do you think? Type into the chat box, what do you think would be different about your life if a EMP occurred? What would change? What kinds of things would be gone after an EMP? And while you do that, I want to just mention what I see. And, a lot of this is speculative because we haven't had this happen in the modern era. But as far as a nuclear EMP, we don't really know what the full impact would be for sure. There are so many variables, such as the power of the EMP, your proximity to it, atmospheric and magnetic conditions of the Earth around you at that moment. Some have surmised that all modern cars would instantly stop running, planes would fall out of the sky, and anything with a microchip would be toast. That would be the worst case scenario that Congressman Bartlett was speaking of earlier. But once again, that's the worst case. There are so many variables that it isn't always cut and dried. For instance, with the automobile situation, something as simple as the direction that your car is facing could affect the outcome. Whether or not it's running, whether or not the car is running when the EMP occurs is another factor. Your car is a lot more likely to survive an EMP if it's not running. And other things like whether it's being garaged at the moment in something like a metal garage that could possibly offer some protection. Even, like I mentioned, things like mountains or the condition of the Earth's magnetic field can impact the outcome of whether your car was damaged or not by the EMP. Various small-scale automobile tests have occurred with EMPs, but in the most well-known test, the budget didn't even allow for testing the cars to the point at which they were damaged. Can you imagine? I mean, what kind of a test is that? In my opinion, it's pretty lame. So there are so many variables and unknowns that cannot be anticipated, and there really has not been a good, solid, large-scale, real-world test since we came into the computer age, at least that I'm aware of. The problem is that doing a real nuclear test is extremely dangerous and from a number of standpoints, and it's not a good idea. And that's why there have not been more of them done. And all this is to say that it would be foolish of me to try and delineate exactly what would and would not be impacted. So I just want to make sure you realize that this is not an absolute thing that we're dealing with here. But I think it's safe to say that a nuclear EMP that occurs at sufficient height and is of sufficient strength would be one of the most debilitating disasters that could occur in the US. Let's just think through one little aspect of your life and trace the impact of an EMP. And going back to cars, your ability to drive. While there are varying thoughts on how many cars would be damaged by an EMP, almost everyone recognizes that there would be a goodly percentage of casualties if it's strong enough. And if you happen to be driving when the EMP occurs, your chances of damage just went up. But let's give you a best case scenario. Let's say that your car was not turned on when it happened and it was parked in a metal garage that may have yielded a little bit of shielding for it. The next question is, how are you going to get gas for your car? Crude oil has to be pumped out of the ground, transported, refined, transported again, distributed to the gas station, and then pumped into your car. And on top of that, the roads have to be clear enough for you to get to the gas station. Each step of this process requires electricity to a greater or lesser extent, and that's just to get gas for your car. If the power grid has been compromised by an EMP, what are you hoping to do in town? Don't expect to be buying groceries if there are any even left. Really don't be expect to be buying much of anything. And for that matter, would the roads even be clear enough for you to drive anywhere in your undamaged car? If many others were impacted by the EMP, the road may be impassable. And that's not to mention the cars that ran out of gas while they were waiting for the road to clear up. So once again, we're talking about a worst case scenario of a strong enough EMP that is close enough to you. But as you can see, the EMP issue is much bigger than just simply shielding your stuff, your car, your electronics, your solar system, these kind of things. Even if everything that you own is undamaged, your life will be dramatically impacted if the critical infrastructure like the power grid or transportation is damaged or shut down. Yes, you heard me right. Even if you have your own off-grid solar system, your life would be incredibly affected if everyone else lost their power. You'll hear a lot of sources out there that are trying to sell you on the idea of protecting your stuff from an EMP, like that's going to magically solve this issue. But I'm just trying to shoot straight with you and give you a dose of reality. Sure, protecting your stuff from damage is very important. I'm all for that. Many of our important household items would not function without power. So let's keep the homestead running for sure. We need that water and other things that may depend on our power system. But I just want you to realize the bigger implications of an EMP. This is much bigger than just you. So while I do believe it's a good idea to prepare for an EMP, the bigger issue is getting your family into a more self-reliant lifestyle that doesn't depend on the system for your next meal or drink of water or for warmth in the winter. We've become so incredibly dependent on other entities that any sort of disruption could be catastrophic, and that's a really bad idea. It's madness. So beyond a nuclear EMP, which may or may not occur, we can turn to the natural phenomenon that has and will continue to happen periodically, and that's geomagnetic or solar storms. And these storms can produce effects similar to the E3 portion of a nuclear EMP, but they don't have the quick, powerful burst of the E1 or the lightning-like effect of E2. Remember, E3 has the greatest effect on long wires like power lines, and it lasts for a relatively long period of time. Because of this, a geomagnetic storm would probably have the most significant effect on the power grid, melting down transformers and other components. There have been a couple of famous geomagnetic storms in the last century or two. The largest was the so-called Carrington event in 1859, when the storm was so intense that it disrupted telegraph lines and it sent sparks flying. In fact, there was so much sparking that telegraph operators even reported fires being started. And of course, due to the lack of technology back then, the Carrington event had very little practical effect on their lives. But it would be a very, very different story for us today. For instance, do you remember the 1989 solar storm that knocked out Quebec's power and left 6 million people in the dark? The Quebec power grid went from normal operation to complete collapse in 92 seconds as a result of this solar storm. And I just want to read you a quick quote from the National Academy of Sciences, what they have to say about the potential effect of severe space weather, because there is, there's debate on the whole nuclear EMP issue, whether one would happen or not, whether other nations have the ability to pull this off and things like that. So what I want you to see is, even if you completely dismiss the whole nuclear EMP issue, this geomagnetic solar storm EMP issue is a very serious one. So this is from the National Academy of Sciences. The impacts of severe space weather events can go beyond disruption of existing technical systems and lead to short-term as well as to long-term collateral socioeconomic disruptions. Electric power is modern society's cornerstone technology, the technology on which virtually all other infrastructures and services depend. Although the probability of a wide area electric power blackout resulting from an extreme space weather event is low, the consequences of such an event could be very high, as its effects would cascade through other dependent systems. Now listen to this. Collateral effects of a long-term outage would likely include, for example, disruption of the transportation, communication, banking, and finance systems, and government services, the breakdown of the distribution of potable water owing to pump failure, and the loss of perishable foods and medications because of lack of refrigeration. The resulting loss of services for a significant period of time in even one region of the country could affect the entire nation and have international impacts as well. And just one more quick reference from an interesting source. Lloyd's of London, a global insurance company, issued a report on solar storm risk to the North American electric grid. And so often when a government agency issues a report, there's a lot of politics that come into play. So it's good to go to more sources. And I don't see any reason why an insurance company would have any reason to get political about this. They're just looking at the probability of how much they could stand to lose from claims associated with the solar storm in the future. So it's very interesting to read this, their take on it. Take a look at this. A Carrington-level extreme geomagnetic storm is almost inevitable in the future. While the probability of an extreme storm occurring is relatively low at any given time, it is almost inevitable that one will occur eventually. Historical auroral records suggest a return period of 50 years for Quebec-level storms and 150 years for very extreme storms, such as the Carrington event that occurred 154 years ago. And it's actually been more than 154 years now. That's when this report was issued. As the North American electric infrastructure ages and we become more and more dependent on electricity, the risk of a catastrophic outage increases with each peak of the solar cycle. Our society is becoming increasingly dependent on electricity. Because of the potential for long-term, widespread power outage, the hazard posed by geomagnetic storms is one of the most significant. Now listen to this. The total U.S. population at risk of extended power outage from a Carrington-level storm is between 20 to 40 million, with duration of 16 days to 1 to 2 years. Wow. The duration of outages will depend largely on the availability of spare replacement transformers. If new transformers need to be ordered, the lead time is likely to be a minimum of 5 months. Wow, that is quite something. Blackouts lasting 16 days to 1 to 2 years, just from a solar storm. And then they went on to describe how this could impact the insurance industry. So we've got all that under our belt. And before we move on, let me just see if we've got any questions relating to what we've looked at that haven't already been answered by my lovely wife. Let's see. How would solar collector, controller, and inverter be affected from natural or man-made EMP? Great question, Ed. And that is actually our next section. How would an EMP affect a solar power system? So I guess we'll just go ahead and jump into this. First, the most accurate answer, in all honesty, that I could give you and that I think anybody could give you in all honesty is that we don't really know for sure what would be affected and to what extent it would be damaged, since there haven't been any widespread powerful EMPs in a high-tech civilization like ours since we entered the computer age. You know, as Congressman Bartlett described earlier, the last time that the US did a nuclear test above the atmosphere was in 1962 over Johnston Island. The operation was called Starfish Prime, and everyone was shocked to find that the test affected Honolulu, which was around 900 miles away. It took out or impacted much of the limited infrastructure that they had back in those days, which was susceptible to EMP. Back then, it wasn't very much, so the main impact was blowing out streetlights and taking down the communications system and things like that. But interestingly, in that same year, the Russians also did an EMP test over Kazakhstan, and they called it the K project. And in recent years, they provided very limited access to the data for this project. The findings were that in spite of an inferior warhead design and in spite of low intensity from the blast occurring at high altitude, the following things occurred. Power generating stations burned out due to their transformers being compromised. And one of the power generating stations even burned down, physically burned down as a result. Underground power lines were fused and rendered inoperable, and they weren't just barely buried, they were buried at a reasonable depth. Overhead power lines were knocked out due to their insulators burning out. Long distance telephone lines shut down. And even many of the 1962 era electronics were damaged in spite of much higher tolerance for EMP than our modern devices. Now, bear in mind that both Starfish Prime and the K project were run long before the digital era that we live in. It's a very different world now. Lots of people have surmised about what would happen now. Some people have built small-scale EMP simulators, which are supposed to simulate the effects of an EMP on devices. But in all honesty, we don't really know for sure if the simulators that they're using are giving us an accurate and realistic idea of what would happen in an actual EMP. So the bottom line is, no one really truly knows from experience what effect an EMP would have on an off-grid solar system. But I'm going to give you my perspective based on years of exposure to this issue. But once again, bear in mind that this is just an educated guess here. So if the EMP was detonated high enough, and if it was close enough to be line of sight to you without mountains in between, and if it was powerful enough, it could impact some of the components in an off-grid solar system. I believe that your solar charge controller would be in the greatest danger, since it's connected to wires that are typically going to be running a long distance, you know, at least 100 feet, if not several hundred feet from the solar array. Next in line would be the inverter. I think it's likely that the inverter would be taken out by an EMP also. Both the inputs to the inverter and the outputs of the inverter are connected to wires, and those wires can act as antennas to channel the energy from the EMP into the inverter and damage it. Batteries, I believe that batteries, like lead acid batteries, you know, old school batteries, should be okay unless they are lithium batteries, which have an onboard electronic battery management system built into them. And that battery management system would be likely to die in the event of an EMP that was powerful enough. And that battery management system is pretty essential for those lithium batteries to work properly. And then the next thing would be solar modules or solar panels. There's debate about whether solar panels would be okay or not. My personal opinion is that they would probably be okay. The vast majority of sources I've found think that solar panels will be okay. And if they were not, it would probably be the diodes that burn out. Diodes are kind of like think of them as a one-way valve that keep power from your batteries from leaking out to the solar panels at nighttime. And the diodes are easily changed if you have an inexpensive spare on hand. You can ask me at the end if you're interested, and I can refer you to some info on how to do that. But moving on, finally, depending on the level of sophistication, your fuel-powered generator could be impacted by an EMP. But my opinion is that following a few precautions would likely save it as well. For instance, if you don't use your generator very much, and you shouldn't need to use it very much with a properly designed solar system, it should be something that's just, rarely needed in the wintertime. Then if that's your usage, if it's rare, intermittent, then I would simply unplug the generator after using it rather than just turning the breaker off. Physically disconnecting that wire is going to help tremendously. You've just unplugged a long antenna that could channel damaging energy into your generator. Now, on this topic of how an EMP affects solar systems, there's several things that I'd like to set straight. First is radiated versus conducted EMP. Now, once again, I know this sounds technical, but it's actually pretty simple. Imagine energy flowing through the air and hitting your solar panels. This is just a lay person's description. I'm not a scientist, and so I'm just describing it in terms like this. That would be the radiated effects of an EMP, like energy flowing through the air, hitting your solar panels. Now imagine several hundred feet of electrical wire that acts as an antenna. That wire picks up the effects of the EMP and conducts those effects of the EMP. It conducts that energy to any devices that are tapping into that wire. This would be called the conducted effects of an EMP. It's what flows through the wires. That's the conducted effects. So radiated flows through the air, conducted is what's going to come in through the wires. And based on small-scale tests, it appears that the conducted effects of an EMP are likely to be much more hazardous for your equipment than the radiated effects. So in other words, what is flowing through the wires is generally going to be more damaging than what is flowing through the air. The second thing that I want to consider here is that long wires act as antennas, creating higher risk for anything connected to them. Believe it or not, small-scale tests indicate that some tiny electronics, like a cell phone, for instance, might actually do okay in an EMP. And that I'm not saying that all cell phones, not by a long shot, but I'm just saying that they might do okay or better than other devices that are connected to long wires. And that's because cell phones are so small and there aren't any long wires connected to them. On the opposite side of the spectrum, a power company may have thousands of miles of electrical wire strung out all over creation, and that can act as a massive antenna. In other words, anything that is connected to the power grid will probably be affected and will be much harder to protect. And this can include a grid tie system. That's right. If you've been around me much, you know I'm a big off-grid proponent. I don't really care for grid tie systems. I'd much rather have an off-grid system. And this is just one of the reasons why. An off-grid system is in a much better position to withstand an EMP than a grid tie system. Off-grid is not immune. I'm not trying to say that, but it's in a much better position. And the shorter your wire runs are, the better. This will most likely affect the wire that connects your solar array to your charge controller and battery bank, as that's typically going to be the longest wire in an off-grid power system, the one that's connecting the solar array to the batteries. So one other thing that I want to touch on for a minute, just miscellaneous things to consider here, is the question of, you might be thinking that a breaker in your solar combiner box and power center would be able to stop the flow of damaging electricity from reaching your sensitive devices. And so I can't categorically say that it will not fail, or I can't categorically say that it won't work without having run real-life full-scale tests, because there's so many variables and so many unknowns. But let's put it this way. Breakers simply don't react fast enough. So take a look at this. The E1 portion of an EMP peaks out in only 5 nanoseconds. That's how fast it happens. That's where it reaches its peak voltage, is in 5 nanoseconds. Now bear with me here. I know these are kind of technical terms, but this is going to be really simple. You're going to see where I'm going with this in just a minute. So A typical household breaker could react in roughly 30 milliseconds. There's some variation based on a number of factors, but that's kind of a best case scenario, would be 30 milliseconds. And even a top of the line midnight solar breaker can only react in, they say, 5 to 160 milliseconds. So let's go with the best case scenario of 5 milliseconds. So we've got an EMP that peaks in 5 nanoseconds, and the breaker reacting in 5 milliseconds. So let's compare apples with apples. 5 milliseconds equals 5 million nanoseconds. Now catch this. The EMP, the E1 portion, peaks in 5 nanoseconds, and the best case scenario with the breaker is that it could react in 5 million nanoseconds. Point made. You see where we're going with this. And just so you know, there are special kinds of, you might say breakers, they're not exactly breakers, but they kind of look like breakers, that are built for the military that are supposed to be able to react quickly enough. They're called silicon avalanche suppressor diodes. They're usually just abbreviated SASD. But they are extremely expensive and they're almost impossible to get a hold of in the private sector. And I'm not even sure that they're available in the voltages that we would need with a solar system. So that's just a little bit about breakers. Now, finally, you might be thinking of lightning arresters. Can a lightning arrestor stop an EMP? Wouldn't they stop an EMP in its tracks, just like they do with lightning? Well, the trouble is that even a good lightning arrestor or surge protection device can't entirely protect your equipment from a direct lightning strike. It's mainly for protection from a nearby strike that is close enough to be damaging, but it's not actually a direct hit. And even if a lightning arrestor could completely protect you from a direct lightning strike, the speed of an EMP is faster than lightning. So for instance, this very nice Midnight Solar SPD that you see here has a response time of 15 nanoseconds, which is excellent when it comes to lightning. But as we've already mentioned, the E1 portion of an EMP can peak in 5 nanoseconds, 15 versus 5. In addition, don't forget that the E2 portion of an EMP comes within a tiny fraction of a second of when the E1 portion. So this lightning arrestor may still be recovering from that initial blow that it got when the E2 hits it. And so the question that comes to my mind is, will the lightning arrestor be able to withstand an assault like that? When it's just been hit up with E1, and then in a split second later, it's hit up with the E2. Who knows? So while good lightning arresters and grounding is essential for lightning protection, it probably won't protect your system from the entire effects of an EMP. It can't hurt, but you can't depend that it's going to protect you entirely from an EMP. So you see the difficulty here. You see what we're facing. This is a very difficult animal to deal with, these EMPs, especially the nuclear EMPs. So let's get into the strategies for keeping solar power operational after an EMP. There's a lot of ideas floating around about how to harden a solar system. Would any of them be effective? Well, your guess is probably about as good as mine. That's the trouble with protecting against something that hasn't happened in our modern circumstances before. I'd love to be able to sit here and just tell you exactly what would happen and here's exactly what will stop it and all of this, but I'd be lying to you. We don't really know. Any testing that has been done is simulated on a small scale, and a test is only a test. It's not the real thing. But with an EMP, so much is variable and dynamic. So an accurate test can only tell you what would happen under those exact conditions and not much else. For instance, you could buy a Faraday or even build a Faraday cage around your components like your inverters and charge controllers and things like that. And if built properly, the Faraday cage may protect those components from the radiated effects of an EMP. But What I'm really concerned about is the conducted effects. In other words, the huge surge of energy that will be flowing through the electrical wires, since any significant length of electrical wire is going to act like an antenna. I've noticed new products coming on the market recently. They are off-grid components that have been developed and marketed as already hardened against an EMP. And this may be accurate or it may not. How do you know? The company has probably declared it to be hardened because it's able to withstand their small EMP simulator. But the question is, would it withstand a real large-scale EMP? And since the effects of an EMP can be modified by an almost infinite number of variables, would it hold up under other conditions than the ones under which it was tested? These are questions that I have. And quite frankly, they're questions that I don't think there are good answers for. And this is why my EMP protection strategy is pretty simple. Too many people are overthinking something that is so variable and unpredictable. Sometimes the more variables you have, the simpler your strategy needs to be, especially when you don't have a massive amount of resources to throw at it, like the military has. So, maybe the military can do really elaborate protection strategies that'll work well for them. But for ordinary folks like you and me, I think the best thing is to keep it super simple. So here are the 3 strategies that I would suggest for keeping your solar system in business after an EMP. Remember, I said it's pretty simple. So first off is pretty standard, simple stuff like proper grounding practices and good lightning protection. And as far as the grounding and lightning protection, these 2 topics are quite interconnected. But for the sake of keeping us organized, I'm breaking them into separate sections, and we're going to look at each of the 3 strategies separately. But grounding and lightning protection is a huge topic that is hotly debated in the electrical world. So while I'm going to give you my opinion, please realize that there are other trains of thought on what the most effective method for handling it would be. But meticulous grounding and lightning protection is our first line of defense. It can help dramatically with nearby lightning strikes, and in my opinion, the tips that I'm going to share with you have the potential to help with some forms of EMP. For instance, if it's a weak EMP, or if you're on the outer fringes of it, or if it's an EMP that is caused by extreme space weather like a geomagnetic storm. In those cases, I think what we're about to look at could actually help, potentially. Could actually save your equipment, maybe. But please bear in mind that there are some things that are beyond your control and just may not be feasible to completely protect against 100% of the time, at least with a reasonable budget. I'm talking about things like a direct lightning strike or a powerful EMP from a nuclear blast that is close enough to you to do significant damage. If you're faced with a lightning strike or an EMP that overcomes your first line of defense, the grounding and lightning protection, then my 3rd strategy comes in. And that is to have cheap spares of vulnerable components stored in a protected container. There's just so many variables with an EMP, and there's so little real-world data or large-scale tests. And I just don't trust the claims that some are making that their system is hardened against an EMP. So in my mind, it's so much simpler, easier, and more foolproof to just get some cheap backup components and store them in a protected container. And then if your existing components are damaged for any reason, you've got a backup on hand. And we'll talk about this more in just a minute. And by the way, you could even, if you had the budget, you could even store a duplicate of what you already have, top quality components. I'm just thinking from the perspective of somebody who, like myself, is on a budget. There, you can get some inexpensive stuff, stash them away, and then only use them if you need them. But first, let's take a look at the grounding precautions that could help. So as a baseline, I would, of course, do everything everything, including the grounding, should be wired to code. That's kind of a given. This means that there's going to be at least one ground rod that is connected to the ground bus bar in the main breaker box. And that connects to the ground on all the appliances and receptacles in your house. Now next, going beyond that, is multiple ground rods at your main grounding point. And this is going to be the place that's near your breaker box. There's going to be ground rods in the ground. And we're talking multiples here. We're talking at least 8 to 10 feet long, 5/8 inch copper ground rods. And I would recommend 3 of them and put them in the ground in the shape of a triangle. And I would, if possible, try and place the ground rods at least 15 to 20 feet away from the other 2 ground rods in order to be most effective. So so you've got kind of like an equilateral triangle there with 15 to 20 feet in between each of the ground rods. Next, you want all 3 of those ground rods to be connected with a loop of number 6 bare copper wire, or whatever it is that you're using to connect to the ground rods from the breaker box. And if you bury that loop of wire, it can add additional grounding potential to the system. But you want all 3 of those tied together very closely. And then another additional point about all this is that any additional ground rods at the solar array, if the solar array is mounted away from the house, and at the generator and any outbuildings, any ground rods that are located elsewhere, they need they need to be installed. It's a good idea. Anything that's any significant distance from the house, if you were to install additional ground rods there. And closely tied to this is that all the ground rods in other locations must be connected to the main ground rod. So while you not only want ground rods in any outbuildings where your generator is and where your solar array is, you also need everything to be connected to the main grounding system. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, but they need to be connected typically with the same type of wire that you would connect to the ground rod, which a safe route would be number 6 bare copper wire. But like I said, I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, but this is one strategy for really effectively grounding your system. You want to get it into the ground as quickly as possible. And anything that's away from the house where there's a length of wire there, you want more ground rods in the ground there, and then you want everything tied together. And one other factor that I should bring up is to use metal conduit. Be sure to use metal conduit around the wire that connects your solar array to your house. Once again, that could be a significant length of wire. And you could also do it for the wire that connects your generator to the house. This metal conduit can help to slow down induced surges, and it can also provide some electromagnetic shielding. So why not take advantage of every help that you can get? So that's a little bit about grounding. Next, on to our second strategy for dealing with EMPs, and that is lightning protection. Now, the purpose of a lightning arrestor is to detect a surge, clamp down, and redirect the energy from that surge into a safe direction. In other words, into the ground. That's just kind of the long and the short of it from a layperson's perspective. But you only want that to happen if there is a real bona fide dangerous surge. So it also needs to be able to clamp down quickly enough to prevent damage to your equipment. Now, lightning arrestors are not a one and done thing. You'll want several of them in your system in order to adequately protect it. And the rule of thumb is that you want the surge to hit the lightning arrestor before it hits a piece of vulnerable equipment, obviously. And if possible, you want it as close as practical to the equipment that it is protecting so that there's not any length of wire there to pick up additional energy from the EMP. You want that arrestor as close as possible to the equipment that it's protecting. So here's an example of where I would recommend placing your lightning arrestors in a typical system. And that would be in any solar combiner box, for obvious reasons. And in the DC disconnect, or it could be the power center if you have a power center, at the input of the wire that's coming from the solar array. In other words, we're talking about you want that arrestor just before the solar array input connects into the charge controller. So picture this long wire running from the solar array to your charge controller. You want an arrestor on either end of that, on both ends of that wire. One is going to protect the current that wire picks up from running into the solar panels, the solar array, and the other arrestor is going to protect it from running into the charge controller. Another place that I would place possibly a lightning arrestor. This one is optional, but that would be at or close to the inverter's DC input. That's where the power is coming in from the batteries to the inverter. This is optional since theoretically you shouldn't need it as long as you have a lightning arrestor on all DC inputs to the power system. But if you've got some DC circuits running off the battery, or you just want to be extra cautious, then it wouldn't hurt to protect the DC input to the inverter. Another place I'd put a lightning arrestor is at or close to the inverter's AC input, and that's where a generator or grid power could connect into the inverter, and it uses that generator or grid power to charge up your batteries or passes it through to the house. That input is vulnerable because you've got a potentially long wire running in from the generator into the inverter, and that wire could pick up energy. And of course, as we've discussed, the grid is that's a disaster waiting to happen. So you want a lightning arrestor there at that point, and then at or close to the inverter's AC output. This one may not be so obvious, but your whole house can act like a giant antenna because of all the wires in it. There's a lot of electrical wires in a typical house, and those wires connect eventually to the output of your inverter. And electricity can flow backwards in those wires and fry your inverter. So you want it at the inverter's AC output, and then finally at or close to your fuel-powered backup generator. And that's once again to protect the other end of that wire that's connecting your generator to your house. We've got one in the house at the power system at the inverter, and the other end of that's connecting to the generator. We'd like a lightning arrestor there as well. So here is my favorite lightning arrestor. Not only does it perform much better than the competitors that I'm aware of, but it also has an LED indicator that lets you know if it's operational or not. And this is a really nice lightning arrestor. Like I mentioned earlier, it's supposed to be able to clamp down in 15 nanoseconds, which is pretty remarkable. And it comes in 4 different voltages for different applications. Now, getting to our third strategy of having a spare on hand of certain vulnerable components. A charge controller, as I mentioned earlier, is probably the most vulnerable of all your components because of that long wire running from the solar array. And you can find an inexpensive charge controllers all over the internet. Just make sure that if your current charge controller is a MPPT, that stands for maximum power point tracking, if it's MPPT model, your spare needs to also be MPPT. And also make sure that the size of the charge controller, in other words, how many amps it can handle, is the same or better than your main charge controller. So basically make sure that you're dealing with the same stats. And like I mentioned earlier, if you have the budget, you could certainly just get a clone, get a second of the charge controller that you already have. But this is for a lower cost option, just getting a cheap one. And same goes for the inverter. Once again, inexpensive spares can be had for not much money. Just make sure that it's built for the same voltage as your battery bank, and that the size or the number of continuous watts that it can produce is similar to what you currently have, if possible. And since this is a spare that you're hopefully never going to need, I'm not even concerned about whether it's sine wave or modified sine wave or all that. My spare inverter is a Xantrex TR3624. It's a modified sine wave, and but it's solid and it has a decent charger on it. And at least in our area, you can periodically find these on Craigslist for not much money. And so I'd rather have something like that than one of those cheapo Chinese sine wave inverters that don't even have a charger built into them. But, you know, just whatever you can find, having something is going to be better than nothing. And then when it comes to solar panels, like I said, that's a big question mark to me. You know, if you want to be extra cautious, you could tuck some away. But personally, I don't really think your solar panels are going to be damaged. If so, probably only the diodes would blow, and they can be replaced easily. And once again, if you want to ask at the end, I can try and point you in the direction of some good resources on how to do that. And then finally, you want to store your inverter and your charge controller in a metal trash can with a lid, and then you want to seal that lid with aluminum tape, and you want to place it in a protected place. So once you have the spares, I would suggest getting a metal galvanized trash can with a lid, line it with cardboard or something non-conductive. Some people say you don't have to do that, but it sure makes me feel better. Place your spare components inside the trash can, put the lid on it, and then seal it with aluminum tape. And small-scale tests seem to indicate that the trash can would be far less effective if you didn't seal the lid with aluminum tape or some sort of metal tape like that. And then I'd like to see you put that trash can down in your basement or in a metal garage or something like that to add some additional protection. And honestly, just the fact that those components are not hooked up to any external wires are going to help tremendously to save them. And by the way, if you do choose to put away a few spare solar panels, I would suggest just putting them in the garage or the basement. And just not being hooked up to wires is likely going to be enough protection to save them if there even were going to be issues there. Now, we've gone through a lot about EMPs and all of this and how to deal with EMPs and that kind of thing, but I feel compelled that to spend just a minute on a reality check. Just think with me for a minute here. If a large-scale EMP occurs and it's powerful enough, life as we know it is okay. I don't know if you're still there with me, but my computer crashed. Um, I think it looks like you might still be. Would you mind telling me in the chat box if you can hear me? I know you probably don't see me. You probably just see a picture of me right now. But just let me know in the chat box if you are able to hear me. And if you are, then I will get rolling again. Oh, awesome. You can still hear me. Wow. So I guess it's possible to recover from a crashed computer in the middle of a webinar. So thanks for sticking in there with us. So give me just a second here and we'll be back on track. So hang on just a sec. Got to get a couple of things up and running here. Okay, so I think we should be back in business here. So I think I have a rough idea of where I lost you there. And I was just saying that if a large-scale EMP occurs and it's powerful enough, life as we know it is probably going to end, at least for quite a while. So yes, it will be important to keep your power on so you can continue to operate the critical systems at home, like water, for instance. But bear in mind that you'll have a lot more to deal with than just your own power system. Probably everyone else's power is going to be gone for over a very, very large area, including businesses. Yes, some of them may have backup generators, but how much fuel do they have on hand? And that's assuming that their backup equipment survived the EMP. There may be very few people who are able to drive, and even if your car runs, what about getting gas? So there may be very little, if any, truck transportation happening, which means no food at the grocery store or fuel at the gas station, et cetera, et cetera. And without power or transportation, most other utilities and critical infrastructure would be unable to function for long, even if their systems were unaffected by the EMP. So what I'm trying to say is we've become so dependent in the modern world on everyone else that even if you have your own power, that doesn't accomplish much if you have nothing to eat, for instance. See what I mean? So my prayer is that there will never be an EMP, as it could be devastating. So while I'm praying for the best, I'm preparing for the worst. And then I'm leaving the rest in God's hands. There's nothing more you can do about it. And worry doesn't accomplish anything. So I would encourage you to do the same. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And so here's what you really need to focus on, in my opinion. In our dependent society, we really need to take a look at our basic necessities of life and work towards getting in a position where we could provide for those basic necessities if needed. So what are the basic necessities of life? We're talking things like water, food, and heat or shelter. These are the basic necessities that we cannot live without. And you'll notice that power is not on this list. And that's because power is not a basic necessity in and of itself. But because of our current modern lifestyle, we live in such a way that some or all of these basic necessities require electricity in order to work right. For instance, water. Most water systems in America depend on electric pumps in some form or other to function. And even a remote country homestead, it's the same. If the water source is a well, chances are that an electric pump is being used to access that water and deliver it to the house. You can grow a garden or an orchard without power, but most locations require irrigation at some point in time during the growing season. And with the way that most folks are set up, that means an electric pump. And I think I'm safe in saying that most homes are heated with a heater that requires electricity in some form, whether it's an electric heater or another type of heater that just needs an electric fan in order to distribute the heat. These are your basic necessities. And the vast majority of you who are attending this class are depending on electricity for at least one, if not more, of these necessities. So rather than try and pitch the idea that solar power is going to just solve everything and that it's the answer to the world's problems, I'm going to be realistic with you. Our problem is bigger than any one solution. In the last 100 years, we've become so incredibly dependent on infrastructure. huge corporations, utilities, and the government. It hasn't always been like that. In fact, in many ways, this is a fairly recent problem, and the solution is not as cut and dried as just installing a solar system. I wish it was, but it's not. Yes, I definitely believe that solar power is an important piece in the puzzle that will help you achieve a greater degree of independence, but there's more to it than that. What about your water system, for example? Let's take a look at that and see if we can make it more independent so it doesn't go down during a power company blackout. And what about food? You can't grow food by plugging a solar panel into the soil. That's where we need to reclaim the knowledge that our grandparents had and learn how to grow a good garden and orchard and small fruits. And if you eat meat or you want milk or eggs, then think of where those food items come from and try getting as close to the source as you can. Raise those chickens or that goat or cow. And if you can't pull all of that off right now, because it is a big job, then start working on a serious pantry that's continually rotating and always has at least months, if not a year, of food in it to get you through until the next harvest. And as far as heat, in my mind, that's a pretty easy one. There is no good reason why every home should not have at least one good quality efficient wood stove that's capable of providing the heat you need. And then you'll need a good supply of wood, of course. So as you can see, there is no silver bullet, or shall I say solar bullet, that's going to miraculously extricate us from this huge web of dependence that we've fallen into. There are a number of things that we need to look at, and power is just one of those things. Because power is something that can make everything else so much easier to do, it is important that we look at it. And having an independent power system enables you to have the best of both worlds. You can live comfortably with a modern lifestyle while at the same time enjoying a great degree of independence. Our off-grid solar system enables us to have plenty of running water, a cold fridge and freezer, lights, computers, kitchen appliances, and a host of other conveniences, while at the same time cutting off our dependence on the power company. Really, just about the only way that you would know that we're off the grid is if you saw our solar panels. And hey, if you do it right, you're not going to have another power bill. How would you like that? But for this to work, you have to do it right. Believe me, you don't just call up a solar company and say, sell me a solar system. You know, I've seen that done many times, and that approach is destined to failure. Even when the solar company supposedly does a quick pseudo design, it doesn't usually end well. If you're going to go off the grid, you need to do your homework ahead of time and do this thing intelligently. But the good news is that if you're willing to invest some time and energy, you can successfully go off the grid without dramatically changing your lifestyle and without it costing a fortune. So if you're not currently set up with an off-grid solar system, I want to tell you about a resource that will make this transition off the grid so much easier, so much less expensive, and so much more successful for you. For years, I did short weekend seminars across the nation on how to reclaim your independence and take responsibility for your basic necessities of life. And when it came to renewable energy, I would give a roughly 1-hour presentation that would give a good solid overview. But I simply didn't have enough time to get into the nitty-gritty details that are so essential for anyone who wants to be off the grid. I looked and looked for a good learning resource to send folks to, and I was frustrated to find that there wasn't much of anything worth its salt. All that I could find were expensive classes and that were, made for a professional solar installer, and they cost thousands of dollars and a ton of time. So for the next year, I developed the ultimate resource for anyone who wants to gain energy independence with an off-grid power system. It has all the details about each component, how to choose the best ones, how they all work together, and how to use them and maintain them. But perhaps my biggest goal with this online training course was to teach you how to accurately design your off-grid power system. That's where I've seen so many problems stem from. Take my friend Pat, for instance. Like most of us, he was not an electrical engineer and he didn't know anything about solar systems, but he knew he wanted to become energy independent and secure his family's power source. So he contacted a solar retailer that he considered to be reputable, and he asked them to design a power system for him. And the problem was that Pat didn't know anything about solar, and he didn't have anyone he could talk to double check the retailer. The retailer sold Pat a system that was very poorly designed and included a couple of components that were simply the wrong thing. Pat had to sell those components at a great loss or give them away just to purchase the right components. And even then, he did that. The system just was not large enough to do what Pat needed. This wasn't an unscrupulous retailer taking advantage of Pat. It was an ignorant retailer who was in a hurry to make a sale to an ignorant owner. No one had sat down with Pat and accurately designed the system ahead of time. The retailer had done a quick freebie design, and it turned out to be way off. By the time Pat contacted me, he was having to switch over to the power company every 2 or 3 days and just to recharge his batteries. He was sure that something was dreadfully wrong, and it was. So I did what has to be done before any solar system can be designed. I sat down with Pat and calculated his average daily power usage. Then I calculated how much power he could reasonably expect to produce with his existing solar system. And you know what? Pat was using way more power than he was producing. Unfortunately, if you try doing that with a solar system, it just doesn't work. So I gave Pat the option of either cutting his power usage or increasing the size of his solar system, or some of both. And he decided to do some of both. So I went through Pat's appliances and gave him some simple suggestions of ways that he could cut his power usage without impacting his lifestyle very much. And then I calculated how much more solar and battery power that he was going to need to make this power system usable and reliable for him. But it hit me. How much money would Pat have saved if all this had been done right from the beginning? And how much blood, sweat, and tears would have been saved if he had taken the time to educate himself beforehand? Thousands and thousands of dollars and untold hours of frustration. He could have avoided all that with the resources available in Off-Grid Boot Camp. And in fact, Pat is partly responsible for inspiring me to develop this course. I'm tired of hearing so many stories of folks who had a bad experience due to simple errors that could have easily been avoided with a little training ahead of time. It's because of so many stories like Pat's that I've developed Off-Grid Boot Camp. My goal with Off-Grid Boot Camp is to put you in the driver's seat and arm you with the information you need to make informed decisions. It's about empowering you to deal with solar retailers intelligently. And it teaches you how to design your own system so you're not dependent on someone else's competency or integrity or the lack thereof. You know, I've been discovering a truism for years. No one is as interested and serious about your situation as you are. So if you don't like the idea of writing a blank check and you want to take an active role in your transition to energy independence, then this online training course is what you need. Ed is one of our current students in Off-Grid Boot Camp, and he had this to say. I'm so impressed with your program, having viewed all of it since subscribing. I had read books, emails, and talked to individuals, and none explained things like your videos. After your help, I'm getting ready to install an off-grid system. And I say, you go, Ed. That's so encouraging when we hear from folks like that. Off-Grid Boot Camp is broken into 9 modules that walk you through each component of your off-grid power system. You'll learn how to choose the right inverter, the best batteries for your individual situation, solar panels, charge controllers, and more. And if you're interested in more than solar power, there's even a module dedicated to micro hydropower and wind power. In Module 1, I teach you how to drastically cut the cost of your power system without compromising on quality and also without dramatically changing your lifestyle. It's about making good choices with appliances. So I go through all sorts of appliances and I give you tips on how to choose the right ones and how to steer clear of wasteful models and so much more. In Module 8, I walk you step by step through the process of designing your own custom off-grid power system. And I even give you my personal calculator that I developed to assist me in designing systems. Doing an accurate design requires a lot of math, and some of it can get a little obtuse. So the calculator takes care of all that for you. All you do is enter the raw data that it asks for, like power usage of your appliances and some readily available climate info. All that, and at that point, the calculator is going to tell you how many solar panels you need, what size of battery bank you need, and it'll give you the ability to play around with it and see the practical impact of changing perhaps to a more efficient freezer, or maybe what would happen if you were to add an air conditioner. You'll know how many additional solar panels and batteries that it would require to do that. And this is so important because now you can get all these things worked out ahead of time before purchasing anything, rather than spending a bunch of money to try and figure out why your new power system isn't working right. John is another student of ours. He says, I'm enjoying your off-grid bootcamp program. I just want to mention that your videos are all meat and no fluff. They're a treasure trove of information, and I'm learning a lot. Once again, kudos to you on the bootcamp. It's a real meat and potatoes program, not a Diet Cola program. Well, thanks so much, John. We appreciate that. And just in case you're wondering, Off-Grid Bootcamp is completely flexible. There's no time frame. You don't have to start by a certain date or finish in a certain amount of time. It's completely up to you. And you decide what you need and when you need it. And while I give you a lot of details in the course, you may not need everything right now. So in most modules, I include a handy overview segment that gives you a quick highlight of what's covered in the module. So you just skim through it now, and then when you decide that you want all the details, go back through the entire module, and that's it. Plus, everything is downloadable. So you don't even have to wait for it to arrive in the mail or worry about getting scratched discs or things like that. This is an online course. So it's designed to teach you, it's designed to be accessed through an online portal. But if your internet connection isn't the greatest, or if you just like the idea of having a local copy of everything, it's right there, ready for you to download whenever you need it. And finally, no matter how good any course is, you're going to have questions. And don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging. In fact, if you enroll in Off-Grid Bootcamp during this promotion, I'll give you access to my coaching program where you can call in to the coaching calls or email me with your questions. And, I've experienced firsthand what a difference it makes to get solid answers from someone who really knows what they're talking about, someone who's looking after your best interest. And that's what you're going to get with your free 6 months of coaching. And since I don't sell solar equipment, I have nothing to gain by getting you to buy a system that's more than you need. My only goal is to get you set up with the best possible system for you, one that really works, and to help you get it as affordably as possible. There are so many ways that I can help you save time and money, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and that's what I'm here for. And you get all that included with Off-Grid Bootcamp. So let's take a look at what you're going to be getting, and then I'm going to make you a super special deal just as a thank you for being part of this class. So what you're going to get, the Off-Grid Bootcamp core curriculum sells for $5.97 every day. And the coaching program, it's hard to place a monetary value on the ability to get honest and thorough answers to your questions. And I'm probably going to phase out the coaching portion of Off-Grid Bootcamp soon. So this may be the last time that I offer the coaching as part of Off-Grid Bootcamp. I'm actually going to be starting a off-grid consulting service where I personally work with my clients one-on-one through each step of the process. And that's going to be many times the cost of off-grid boot camp due to the amount of time involved with each person. But you get the chance to get access to coaching with me at an extremely low price. In fact, I'm throwing it in for free right now, but the value you'd normally pay at least $300. And I'll tell you what, I'm also going to throw in some extras for you during this promotion. You'll get the ultimate Q&A sessions with recordings of over a dozen Q&A sessions that I had with students like yourself, covering a bunch of things that you might not even think to ask. That's a $47 value, and I'm giving it to you for free. I'm also going to give you a copy of my ebook, Off-Grid Power Systems, that presents an excellent overview of how it all works together. It's perfect for those of you who prefer to read. The ebook is a $20 value that you'll be getting for free during this promotion. I'm also going to give you the Off-Grid Buyer's Guide. It's a class that goes into specific brands and models of equipment. I even make some recommendations of where to purchase from. This class is a $29 value, but it's yours for free when you enroll in Off-Grid Bootcamp now. And in case you're looking for extra details on how to go off the grid for a reasonable cost, I'll give you an excellent 3-part video series called Off-Grid on a Budget. And this video series is packed with valuable content that would be a steal at $45, but it's yours for instant consumption when you enroll in Off-Grid Bootcamp now. So the value of what you're getting is over $1,000. And with the special that we're going to be running today, you'll get all this for just a fraction of that price. But even if it was the full $1,000, I want to get you to think about something for just a moment. If all this did was to help you cut down your power usage to 15% of the national average and save you tens of thousands of dollars in off-grid costs, would it be worth $1,000? And if all this did was save you from wasting thousands of dollars by purchasing the wrong off-grid equipment, would it be worth $1,000 to you? And if all this did was enable you to successfully become energy independent while living comfortably, would it be worth $1,000? You can see why it would be a great deal at $1,038. But I'm going to make you an amazing offer. I'm not even going to charge the $597 that Off-Grid Bootcamp sells for by itself every day. You've taken the effort to register for this class, and that tells me you're serious. And because of that, because you're so serious, I'm going to give you instant access to everything we've talked about today for just one single payment of $297. And all you have to do is click the button on the right. You should see a button appear. If you are not, if you're on a smartphone, you may have to swipe up to see it, but all you have to do is just click the button and you can get started within literally a minute or so. Now, just to put this in perspective, you could easily spend at least $200 to $300 for just a professional solar shade analysis, and that's all you would have. We won't even get into what it would cost to have someone do a thorough system design for you. So just the solar shade analysis could pay for this entire package, and then you'd end up saving yourself thousands of dollars in system costs. And that's not to mention the money you can save by avoiding common mistakes that many newbies make. So if you're ready to start your off-grid transition the right way, and you want to have a really successful experience with it, then click the button to the right. You know, one of our students named Howard shared this comment with us. He said, I took this off-grid boot camp and it was very, very worth the money it cost. I can highly recommend it. And Dave said it was the best money I ever spent. Now, how do you know if off-grid boot camp is right for you? Well, I'll tell you what, test this out for a solid month. Watch or download all the videos and outlines, ask all your questions on the coaching calls, and at the end of 30 days, if you're not completely satisfied with what you're getting out of it, if for whatever reason you find that it just isn't for you, I'll give you a full refund, no questions asked. Just send me an email. And guess what? You'll get to keep everything you've downloaded as a free gift just for taking the time to give it a try. So really, you have nothing to lose. Either you love the course and you find that it saves you tons of time, money, blood, sweat, and tears, or else you're going to end up with a bunch of awesome training material for free. You may think that I'm sticking my neck out, but this is how confident I am that you're going to be completely satisfied with Off-Grid Bootcamp. If you're not happy, I'm not happy. No harm, no foul. So if you're still trying to decide whether Off-Grid Bootcamp is right for you, I'm making it really easy. You don't have to figure that out today. And how would you really know without jumping in and testing it out? So click the button on the right and give it a shot. You'll have 30 days to decide if you want to keep it or not. And if it's not what you were looking for, just send me an email and you'll get every penny of your money back, no questions asked. You know, another student of ours named Bob says, you really do cover everything a person needs to know about this topic. It is very much worth the $297 you're charging. I doubt if there's a better info source anywhere. Thank you for the awesome service. Well, thanks, Bob. We appreciate that too. So how do you get started? Well, the first thing is you're going to click on the button to the right, or if you're on a smartphone, you may need to swipe up in order to see the button. That's going to get you to the details page. On the details page, you'll see the checkout form. Just fill out all your info, click on the button to complete your order, and you'll be taken to your Off-Grid Bootcamp dashboard where you can access everything instantly. And then within 5 or 10 minutes or so, you should receive an email with your login details so you can access Off-Grid Bootcamp in the future. So right now is your opportunity to get off of bottom dead center and actually start your off-grid transition. This is your chance to become energy independent. Whatever your situation is right now, wherever you live, however soon you plan on going off the grid, this is your opportunity to do it right the first time, save yourself a bundle of money, and have a really positive off-grid experience. So just click on the button on the right to get started now. So I want to take a little bit of time here to answer a few questions. I don't want to keep you guys up too long. I want to be respectful of your time. So I'm going to try and pick out some questions that are recurring here unless we don't have too many. And so please feel free to ask again if we weren't able to get to your questions earlier in the chat box. And so don't feel like we're ignoring you. And if for whatever reason we don't get to your question, I will try and reply via email within the next few days. You're more than welcome to email me if you don't hear from me. But anyway, here's a couple of questions that we have here. Penny asks, has the buying class been updated for resources lately? Yes, we do update it as there's not a lot of volatility in off-grid equipment. So there's not a lot of change, but as things change, we do update. We've actually got a couple of updates in the works right now, but we've been doing some updates as equipment changes for off-grid stuff and things like that. So yes. And Brownlow says, missed some info on copper wire grounding. Does anyone remember 8 to 10 feet long, 5/8 inch copper triangles? So what that was for the ground rods. That was for your actual grounding rods. The technical name would be grounding electrodes. And I was recommending that they be at least 8 to 10 feet long and that they be copper and at least 5/8 inch thick. And then the suggestion that I had was, you know, code is only going to require for a residential house 1 ground rod most likely. But my suggestion was to do 3 ground rods in the shape of a triangle and at least 15 to 20 feet apart, and where each of them is 15 to 20 feet apart. And the idea is you want the distance between them to be at least twice what their length is. So if they are 10 feet long, if the ground rods are 10 feet long, then you'd want at least 20 feet in between them to get the maximum benefit from that configuration. And then you would want to tie all of those together. You would want to tie all of those ground rods together directly. We're not talking tying each of them into the same breaker box. We're talking each of those ground rods, you do it basically a loop running around the triangle with the same kind of wire that you're using to tap into the ground rod, which, a safe choice is typically going to be number 6 bare copper wire. I think in some situations the code may allow number 8, but I just say number 6 to be a little safer. And so number 6 bare copper wire connecting all of those. But definitely check with your local codes. If codes require something more than what I'm saying, then obviously you're going to go with that. But that I just described is going to be like above and beyond what code recommends. So I hope I answered it. Feel free to follow up, Brownlow, if I was not answering what you were asking about. Tyler says, how do I know what size system I would need in the future if I do not own a home yet? Only 22. Well, that's a good question. And what I would, there's a couple of routes that you could go with that. One route that you could go is you could say, okay, right now I don't have a home, so there's a lot of unknowns for me. And so I'm going to educate myself. I'm going to learn about off-grid power systems. It takes some time to get up to speed on these things. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now during the time that I have, so that when I do have my own home, when some of these questions are answered for me, then I can be better prepared to go ahead and jump in head first into this, rather than having to start the learning process at that point in time. That's one option. The other option that you could do is actually kind of what I did when I was probably not much older than you. I started shopping for deals, and when there was a sale on something, I'd buy up. I think, if I recall right, I think the first off-grid component that I bought, and this was before I was on my own, the first off-grid component that I bought was solar panels. There were some blemished, they were just cosmetically blemished solar panels, and they were a great deal back then. Now it would have been a bad deal, but back then it was a really good price for the times. And so I jumped all over it, and I just estimated, I just kind of did a guesstimate, and that's where education at this point in time is going to help you, because you can kind of run through, do some estimates, say, well, maybe take your lifestyle at whatever home that you're living in right now and figure that plus a little more. And so kind of get a rough idea, and you can, as you're able to, jump on sales, be watching different websites, and when they run a sale, pick up your solar panels. When they run a sale on charge controllers, pick that up. But you don't want to do that until you know what you're doing, because you may end up buying the wrong components and waste a whole bunch of money. So that would be my suggestion to you, Tyler, and I hope that helps. Mick says, for how long is this offer good for? I'm just getting my property and home going. This offer is going to be good for several days. Sorry, I don't have an exact ETA for you, but several days, probably through the weekend would be my guess, something along those lines. And Tyler says, where did you learn knowledge of my age? Oh, well, I was assuming where you put only 22, that was referring to your age. So sorry if that was referring to something else, but on the previous question, that was, you posted at the end, only 22. Yeah, that would be kind of creepy if I just knew your age out of thin air. Let's see, do we have anything else here before we finish up? Let's see. Okay, I think that's probably, I don't want to keep you here forever and a day. I'm sorry, Tyler. He says, no, like when you were my age, where did you learn your knowledge on solar systems? Sorry, gotcha. I guess I'm trying to remember how old I was when we moved off the grid. I think I was like 19 or 20, something like that, when my family moved off the grid, and we knew nothing about it. And that's part of why I'm passionate about training and education and things like this, because we had to learn in the school of hard knocks. We we made quite a few mistakes. We did some things the hard way, and I don't want you to have to go through that. So where I gained my knowledge was in the School of Hard Knocks. And then after that, after living off the grid for a number of years, I decided I wanted to kind of make a science out of this and really plumb the depths of it and do a lot of research and figure out what is the best way of doing this and how to condense it into something that's easy to understand. And so I spent quite a while working on that in order to be able to, do presentations and things like that on the subject. And so that it was just School of Hard Knocks for me, but it took years and it took trial and error and things like that, things that I would like for you to avoid if at all possible. There's always going to be a certain amount of trial and error, but we'd like to avoid as much as we can. Janice says, how do you find Roscoe Bartlett's video? I'll tell you what, if you're just talking about just that short clip, those 2 short clips that I played, if you'll email me, I can send you the link to them. But if you want to see more of his interview, what we were filming him for was a video called Urban Danger. And it kind of goes through this big picture that I was presenting today of not just off-grid power, but also having food storage, growing food and food storage and water system and heat system and things like this in place. And it goes through a bunch of different people's homesteads and how they do things. It's not a lot of technical detail. It's more of a visual overview where you just kind of see what can be done. It's not so much about how to do it, but what can be done. And on the beginning of that is Congressman Bartlett. And we actually, a little bit later, take you on a tour of a little guest house that he set up off the grid. That's kind of interesting. Okay, so one more. Tyler, following up here. Okay, would the boot camp teach me the all basic things like that as well as the advanced knowledge? Yes, absolutely. It starts out with the assumption that you know almost nothing about solar systems or off-grid power systems, and then it takes you from that point to basically teach you everything you need to know about how to choose the right components, how to design a system, how to use and maintain it, and all that sort of thing. So yes, it definitely gets into the advanced stuff. So anyhow, well, I'm going to go ahead and finish up. I don't want to keep you on here forever. I appreciate each of you for being part of this. But before we end, I just want to say that if you're serious about getting your family in a better position, and if you want to become energy independent without dramatically changing your lifestyle or going bankrupt, then I highly recommend that you take advantage of this awesome special that's running right now and enroll in an off-grid boot camp for a fraction of what it would normally cost. And if you jump on board right now, you'll get to be part of my coaching program for free, so I can get your questions answered and help you through this process. But it all starts with you making the decision to go forward. And your first step is going forward is to arm yourself with the information that you're going to need in order to be successful. So click on the button to the right, or if you're on a smartphone, swipe up to see the button and take your first step towards energy independence. And I want to thank you so much for attending the class tonight and being a part of this. I hope you're going to get some really helpful ideas, that this class pointed you in the right direction. And I will consider this class a complete success if it inspires you to get your family into a more independent situation. Remember, you need water, food, and heat or shelter. And unless you want to live like Little House on the Prairie, you're also going to need an independent source of power to do all of that. So let's stop talking and let's start doing. It takes time, but just take it one step at a time. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. So whatever your first step is, please take it tonight. Don't wait until tomorrow. Life is busy and you're going to forget about it. So do it now while it's fresh in your mind and set some goals for yourself. And then let's work on reaching those goals. But it all starts right now. So take your first step toward independence, whatever it is. Please take it now. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off, but I'll stick around here in the chat box for a while and we'll try and get everything answered. Once again, if I failed to get to your question, please forgive me. I'll be here if you're still on. Hit me up here in the chat box, or you can always email me. But thanks again, and hope you have a good night tonight.